Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rowan Pett, Executive Director here at the Australian Chamber of Commerce in South Korea. It's my pleasure to be hosting today's webinar, The Future of US, Australia and Korea Relations in the Biden Era, with our special supporters, the AKBCWA. Seeking to have a discussion around the potential impacts of the new presidency and the implications on bilateral ties, today we are joined by leading political international relations analyst, Gordan Flake, CEO of Perth US Asia Centre, and Professor Robert Kelly from Pusan National University. Moderating today's session, we'll be joined by a distinguished journalist from the Washington Post, Min Joo Kim. Min Joo has written extensively on the region's diplomacy and politics with a focus on US-Korea relations. Among her stories, she has covered the Trump-Kim nuclear talks, North Korea's evasion of sanctions, and most recently, South Korea's strategy on combating coronavirus. Before handing it over to our guest panelists, may I formally welcome Min Joo to the floor, and she'll provide a quick overview of the recent developments in US politics. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rowan. I'm Min Joo, sole reporter for the Washington Post. And before I begin, it's a great pleasure to participate in this panel with our guests and also welcome you to this event. The topic for this afternoon is the relationship between United States, Australia, and South Korea in the Biden era. And yeah, President Joe Biden was sworn in last month, and given the big shifts in the directions of US foreign policy during the past 4 years, the Biden administration will seek to re-engage and cooperate with the Asia Pacific and to build norms once again. And the administration is also expected to underscore the importance of multilateralism in the region and demonstrate their commitment to alliance and partnership. I guess the questions that we are gonna explore today would be, what can Australia and South Korea expect from the new Biden administration, and how will the ongoing competition between US and China affect the two countries? So we have two distinguished panelists today to answer these questions for us. I don't think we need no introduction, but I'll give a brief one. So Professor Gordan Flake is the founding CEO of Perth US-Asia Centre at the University of Western Australia. And he's a leading authority on the Indo-Pacific with a particular specialization on Korea. And also we have Professor Robert Kelly, Professor of International Relations at Pusan National University. And he is an expert on security in the Northeast Asia and US foreign policies, and also international financial institutions. Our experts will examine Australia and South Korea's expectations for and relations with the incoming administration. And I'll firstly invite Gordan to give us his thoughts on Australia-US relations.
Well, thank you, Min Joo, and thank you to Rowan and the Australian Chamber of Commerce in Korea for hosting this event. Australians who are watching the program today will quickly ascertain that there's a little bit more Arizona in my accent than Australia, even though we in Western Australia might have a slightly different twang, not this different. I have spent 25 years in Washington, D.C., working in the foreign policy think tank community there before defecting to the farthest city on the planet on land away from Washington, which is Perth, Australia, just over 7 years ago. Took out Australian citizenship last year. Never been a better time to do so, as Perth is a unique bubble within a bubble in the COVID era, despite the events of this week. And mercifully, given the relationship between Australia and the US, I'm able to be a dual citizen between those two countries. And for the purposes of this discussion today, I'm honored to serve on the board of the Australia-Korea Business Council, WA, AKBCWA, and I'm delighted that they're working together with the Australian Chamber on this important discussion. And again, let me say I'm particularly delighted to be on the same panel as Robert. I follow him closely. I read Min Joo's writings and reporting quite closely, so I look forward to a very good discussion. I'm going to take this from a very Australian perspective in terms of looking at the relationship, because the thing that has changed, the thing that is different, which makes this event timely is obviously the change of government in Washington, D.C. So with the Biden administration, there's a lot of things that are different, not just with Korea, not just with China, but with the world writ large, and it even impacts countries like Australia. Now, having said that, I would argue that Australia probably did a better job of managing its relationship with the Trump administration than any other U.S. ally. If you think of the real tensions that existed between the U.S. and NATO and Canada, or even Japan, and particularly Korea, with the sharp contestation around issues like cost sharing for U.S. troops, and a very testy, shall we say, political relationship. Having said that, Australia quickly recalibrated to the Trump era, is in a little bit of a different position than most countries in the world, in that it has a trade deficit with the United States, spends well more than 2% of its GDP in terms of armed forces. So Australia kind of came out relatively unscathed. But if I take a step back and put it in the context of Australia's relations, not just with the United States, but in Korea, there is a broader narrative which is really important to understand. And that is that Australia is a relatively small population, a large land, small population of about 25 million people, has long held two basic strategies to guarantee its own national security, its own sovereignty. Those are, number one, reliance on an alliance partner far away, just the same as South Korea and the United States. And number two, also very similar to South Korea, reliance on what Australians call the rules-based order, what some in Korea would call the liberal rules-based international system, or if you're academics, you might want to frame it as a middle power kind of network, but one way or the other. Australians have from the very beginning, like Korea, been joiners. They're very proactive at regional institutions, international organizations, standards, norms, laws, institutions, because those things guarantee, or at least enhance, our ability to live in a world where might does not make right, where instead you live in again, weak though it may be, an international system of laws, standards, rules, norms, and institutions. And so if you take a step and think back on it, almost every regional institution in the Indo-Pacific are institutions where South Korea and Australia were together in those institutions early on. The APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Initiative, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, actually one exception, which I'll get to in a minute, the Trans-Pacific Partnership is one where Australia was a very important leader going forward. So in a nutshell, you cannot help but be optimistic about a Biden administration if you're looking at it from an Australian perspective, because the Trump administration, in its kind of America first approach to the world, often was America alone, often antagonized alliances. And I'm someone who, after 25 years in Washington, D.C., continues to firmly believe that America's greatest strength isn't just the brute strength of its military, but the strength of its ideals, the strength of its ideas, and its networks, its alliances around the world, the systems and institutions that it built and supported. And so for the last 4 years, with the United States being antagonistic towards multilateralism, being antagonistic towards international systems, standards, and norms, that was not a good time for Australia. And so to see the United States, even in the first couple of weeks under a Biden administration, kind of snap back through a series of executive orders and rejoin the Paris Climate Accords, rejoin the World Health Organization and be proactive on that front. There is a broad expectation here that the scope of areas for cooperation between Australia and the US has expanded dramatically. And so while yes, there may be some newfound tensions on climate change, and while yes, the current Australian government handled the Trump era well, the future is actually far more conducive to an Australian approach than the last 4 years have been. Now, I'm going to tie that back to Korea because there is an interesting analogy here. We at the Perth US Asia Center just late last year put out an edited volume on Korea and the Indo-Pacific, after having done similar volumes on India, on Japan, on Indonesia, and on Vietnam. And Korea was a challenge to do because among the countries I just listed, Korea at this point is probably the least proactive in thinking about the Indo-Pacific as a region and engaging the Indo-Pacific as a region. In fact, there's there's an allergy in Korea even to utilizing the term or the framing of that. Part of that is tied to historical legacy issues with Japan. A major part of that is tied to the imminent and very real challenges and a prioritization of those challenges on the Korean Peninsula. And part of that was just due to the fact that the United States wasn't as proactive on that front as it might have been and as it likely will be in the future. But in the end, what that has meant is that the Korea-Australia relationship is, in my view, significantly underdone. It should be so much stronger. So if you look today at the Australia-Japan relationship or the Australia-Indonesia relationship or the Australia-Vietnam relationship or the Australia-India relationship, you'll find that almost every other country within the Indo-Pacific views Australia as a strategic partner, and they're eager to engage with us down here. Even countries outside this region, the UK, Canada, Germany, France, they all are now seeking to assert their status as Indo-Pacific partners and see Australia as a natural partner in that endeavor. Korea, on the other hand, tends to have a very peninsular focus. And as much as it does think it's this Shinnambang Jungcheck, this new southern policy, which tends to stop at Jakarta, doesn't go all the way down to Australia, isn't framed in a broader narrative about the transformation of the region. And as a result, in very important discussions like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, like the Quad, like a whole range of issues on maritime security, et cetera, where we would hope and expect that Korea would be an active player, Korea has largely been absent, has not risen to that level of partnership. And so my framing of the chapter I wrote on the bilateral relationship was peers, not partners. Both Korea and Australia do a really good job at managing up and dealing with our relationships with the United States or Japan or the EU as a whole, or even China, despite difficulties. And we also do a really good job of managing down and working with countries that are less developed than either of our countries are. But we haven't quite figured out how effectively to work together as peers and make those deep partnerships. And that's something that I'm hopeful will come in the coming years. And one added cause for that hopefulness is the Biden administration. Because as long as the Biden administration was checked out on multilateralism, as long as the Trump administration had checked out on multilateralism, on regionalism, on regional institutions, et cetera, there was very little pressure from Korea's most important ally for Korea to do more. In fact, Korea was quite content to be a peninsular power focused on a single issue, that being North Korea. And that's something I think will change. I think I've gone on too far already, or too long already, so I'll wrap that up as my initial comments, but I trust that will spark a lot of conversation in the later session of this conference. So.
All right, yeah, thank you so much, Gordan, for your comments. And let me next turn to Bob, and I'd like to invite you to walk us through US-South Korea relations.
Sure, thanks. I mean, this is a huge topic, right? 10 minutes isn't nearly enough. So I think that the best way to capture it is the term that Gordan used there before. So something wrong? Where? Oh, do we have a Zoom bomb incident?
Yeah, we do. But you proceed. If anybody is qualified to deal with these, it is you. Believe me, this was not planted, but grandkids.
I got it. No, that's
keep going.
That's my career now for 4 years. Right, a snapback is probably the best expression, right? The one that Gordan just used, right? Which is to say that South Korea and the United States have a long relationship that predated Donald Trump. Before Donald Trump sort of took over all of our mind space, for the last 5 years, there was a world before this where South Korea and the United States had a fairly normal relationship, right? I mean, the United States has a lot of treaty allies. South Korea is one of them. That relationship was, I would argue, mostly normal. Most of the time, North Korea is sort of a unique opponent, but it's not as if the United States and South Korea were sort of at each other's throats and stuff like this in the past, right? I mean, the United States and South Korea, the relationship was actually pretty solid. And even though Trump came in, it was sort of like this hurricane. In 2017, we're going to have a war. And in 2018 and 2019, suddenly the North Koreans were our friends. And, Trump fell in love with Kim Jong-un and the DMZ. Remember, Trump said the DMZ was going to be his model for the border wall with Mexico? I mean, we all sort of got distracted by that. And I think we missed the fact that a lot of the underlying structures in the relationship between the two, between the US and South Korea, basically remain unchanged. right? I mean, I live here and I still have a lot of my American friends who were here 5 or 6 years ago. They're still here. A lot of the companies are still here. There was no big American capital flight. The American bases are still here. The U.S. military is still here. The American diplomatic presence is still here, right? I mean, a lot of this sort of like Trump chaos was actually a very elite phenomenon up at the very top. And we all paid attention to that, right? There wasn't any U.S. ambassador to South Korea, for example, during the worst year of 2017, which kind of scared everybody. It's like, we're sort of on autopilot here. But below that, a lot of the structure was actually still there. And it's still here now. And so now that Biden is back, I think, again, what Gordan said, snapback is probably what you're going to get. Things are going to return to where they were before. You may not like that. If you like Donald Trump and you wanted things to be shaken up, you're not going to like that. You see it as the blob or the deep state or whatever. But, the deep state of the American-South Korean relationship is still basically here. And Biden, I think, is going to step back into that. Particularly, I think, if you look at Biden's history in the past, he's a pretty establishment sort of like Washington policy kind of guy, right? He was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, where he had fairly establishmentarian views about American liberal hegemony or the liberal international order, like Gordan was saying. And I had fairly establishmentarian views about North Korea, where he supported the sanctions and stuff like that, but he wasn't a hawk, he wasn't a super hawk, he wasn't a bomber, right? And so I think with Biden, you're basically going to get a sort of return to what was before under the Obama administration. Now, I would argue that that wasn't all that bad, and that particularly given that our choices on North Korea are so poor that I'm not sure that we can really do much better, right? I mean, Trump's inclination was, I think, to just give stuff away on North Korea and sort of hope that they would reciprocate. But barring that, I'm not really sure our options in North Korea are that great. We'll get to that in a moment. So we're going to get sort of a return to what was under Obama. Again, that was satisfactory to my mind, not great, but okay, given our poor choices. Specifically, what alliance reassurance means, I think, is more visits, more dialogue, more joint statements. I just saw on pop up here on my phone saying that Chungwa at the Blue House and the White House just agreed we're going to have a comprehensive statement or strategy between South Korea and North Korea, between South Korea and the U.S. on North Korea. We always kind of talk like that, but I mean, at least they're, working together again, right? And at least it sounds like we're going to have, some groups getting together and talking about these issues rather than, the two countries just on parallel tracks regarding North Korea, like we had under the Trump presidency. So I think we're going to see a return to the normal relationship, particularly at the strategic level. While meanwhile, the social relationship, sort of the tourism and the trade and the student exchanges, that really has gone untouched, and so has the business relationship. Again, there was no massive U.S. capital flight or anything like that. Even in 2017, when Trump was saying fire and fury, there was no there was no flight from the Wuhan and so on. Specifically on the big sort of strategic issue, the big political issue between the two of the last couple of years, Donald Trump's sort of insistence that the South Koreans dramatically ramp up how much they pay for the placement of USFK, U.S. Forces Korea. My guess is the Biden people will step back from that. I do think that behind the scenes, certainly in my experience with South Korean officials at conferences and whatnot, that they do recognize and broadly understand that South Korea has gotten wealthier and should pay more and more of the bill over time. But I think they were really sort of hit hard by the fact that Trump quintupled the bill in one shot and also wanted to renegotiate, these are called the special measures agreements. Trump wanted to renegotiate SMA every year instead of the traditional 5 years. So my guess, and that was a big thorn, right? I mean, again, if you guys are in South Korea, you know this. So I presume that it sounds like that the Biden people are going to do away with that. We're going to go back to the 5-year framework, which usually involves some incremental increase in what the South Koreans pay over time. What else? Trump also renegotiated KORUS, the Korea-U.S. trade deal. My guess is the Biden people will probably take a look at that and see if the Trump people did any sort of like weird, crazy damage or something like that. Again, it's sort of, the Trump people kind of threw these things together on the fly. So I imagine there'll be sort of a brief review of that. But, again, that relationship has proceeded, I think, reasonably well. So I don't think there will be much there, again, given that this is a business audience mostly. And then finally, on the larger, the grand strategic issues that Gordan mentioned, I think on Indo-Pacific, particularly on China's rise and on China's behavior in the South China Sea, I do think in time the Biden people are going to push South Korea on this. South Korea has tried for a long time to sort of walk between the raindrops between China and the United States. I think we all kind of know that, right? Of the South Koreans, export a great deal, of course, to China. It's the #1 export market. And so the South Korean government often tries to sort of play down the fact that it's a U.S. treaty ally, right? To say, oh, we're trying to get along with China too. And more and more, it's going to be hard for South Korea to avoid sort of these forks in the road, right? The sort of the Venn diagram of an overlapping space where South Korea can have good relations with China and the United States is, I think, slowly diminishing. I don't know if that's going to disappear under the Biden administration, but it's going to get harder and harder for South Korea to avoid this, particularly as China's behavior, particularly along its maritime tier, gets worse, right? I mean, if the South China Sea thing really explodes in the next 5 to 10 years, South Korea is going to have to make a strategic choice, which its elites have been trying to avoid for a while. I don't think that's imminent, but I do think, as Gordan was talking about, I mean, this idea that sort of China is this growing challenge to the Indo-Pacific liberal order and the rest, that this is there. And the South Koreans are kind of trying to slide around it a lot, and that's just going to get harder and harder the more Chinese power grows. All right, so I got a couple more minutes. So on North Korea, again, it's just, I would also argue for sort of a snapback, right? Which is to say that Biden, again, is sort of a fairly establishmentarian kind of guy. When he was vice president under Obama, right, he supported basically the sort of traditional American line towards North Korea, which is containment, deterrence, sanctions, isolation. I mean, that's more or less the basic package that the U.S. has pursued toward North Korea for decades now, and Biden didn't wander from that too far. Most importantly, Biden wasn't an ultra. He wasn't a bomber, like McMaster in 2017. But Biden also wasn't one of these sort of big pro-engagers like Trump became, I guess, in 2018, where we should give the North Korean stuff and maybe they'll give us something back. I mean, Biden will probably stick with a fairly basic package of North Korea as a threat, but not an enormous threat, and therefore can be contained, but we don't actually have to strike them. And that's more or less what you got from Obama. There won't be summits; those days are over. But Trump. I mean, remember the summits were kind of a joke, right? I mean, Trump didn't prepare for them. It wasn't like Camp David or something, where Carter really did a lot of work in the 70s, bringing Israel and Egypt together for like a big bang deal. I mean, Trump didn't do anything like that, right? He just got on a plane and flew into Singapore and just walked into a room, right? And Biden's not going to make that mistake. Biden's not just going to walk in blank into a room and just sort of hope for the best like Trump did at Singapore and Hanoi. Instead, I think he's going to do what the Obama people tried to do, which is sort of like a small deal. The Obama LEAP deal in 2012 is probably the model here, a sort of small deal that gets the U.S. and North Korea sort of making a few changes, right? And I hope that works. And then maybe we have another deal on top of that. We build toward a summit. That's the only possible way that I could see Obama or Biden actually meeting with the North Koreans. The North Koreans go through 2 or 3 deals with the United States where they keep their end of it, and we keep our end of it too. The United States has a credibility problem in dealing with North Korea also, by the way, right? But you'd have to have several of these kinds of things that iterate and get bigger and bigger that sort of work up towards a POTUS summit. Biden is not going to do what Trump did and just sort of fly in there. Next, the United States under Biden will not accept the nuclear weaponization of North Korea. We will not accept that North Korea is a nuclear weapon state, even though it is, and we kind of don't really have a choice. We won't actually formally state this. I'm not sure if the U.S. is ready for that. It will eventually happen, I think maybe in like 10 years, but I don't think the Biden people will get there. So we'll still be banging away on the idea that North Korea should denuclearize, which of course they will not do. Because they won't do that, the nuclear discussion regarding North Korea will start to spread towards things like proliferation, right? Are the North Koreans going to start to sell diagrams and schematics and fissile material maybe to whomever because they're broke because of the sanctions, and to safety, right? As the North Korean nuclear program gets larger and larger, as they have more and more weapons and more material, more and more stuff, more and more facilities, fears are going to grow about some kind of Chernobyl incident happening in North Korea. Remember, the North Korean program is completely without supervision. There are no inspectors, no IAEA, nobody gets in, and we have no idea really what they're doing. And we know that there was at least one serious emergency at a North Korean facility a couple of years ago where a tunnel collapsed and a couple hundred people were killed, right? So this is going to sort of grow, right? They're not going to denuclearize. So now come the second order issues of safety and proliferation and the rest of it. And then finally, because I know I'm out of time here, I don't actually think that North Korea or South Korea, quite honestly, will be that high on the Biden agenda. The Biden people will go back to what was, which wasn't great, but was okay. And then the Biden people are going to get completely distracted by domestic issues, most obviously COVID, the implosion of the economic, I don't want to say implosion, but sort of the retrenchment, sort of, economic troubles in the United States, the possibility of sort of like a growing, I don't know what you call it, a right-wing insurgency in the United States, the sort of militia guys who attack the Capitol. And there are all these sort of issues domestically, plus the United States has got to do a lot of work with European allies, reassurance. And so the Korea will be sort of down the list. It's not going to be at the top unless the North Koreans go off and do something outrageous. And, we get like a Cuban Missile Crisis or something again out here, but I don't think that's likely. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bob, for your insights. And that was an effective recap of the diplomatic relations during Trump times, and also a good look into prospects for the upcoming Biden era. And So yeah, we would like to jump onto questions now. And yeah, we want to address as many questions as we can. So please really indicate your interest. And yeah, so I actually want to start with one myself first. Actually, it's relevant to what Gordan said before. So I wanted to ask, is South Korea missing out from its absence in the quadrilateral security dialogue, I mean, Quad? And I want to hear about what will be the effect on South Korea and Australia. What will be the pros and cons if this happened? And it's especially known that the Biden administration seeks to revitalize the Quad. I hope this question is clear, and I will maybe ask Gordan to start and Bob to share his views then.
Sure, I'm happy to. And let me step back a little bit and put regionalism in context. For most of my professional career, it was a presumption, an article of faith that security cooperation, any type of security architecture in the broader Asia region was too hard. And that the only real avenue to move forward to serious regional integration, regional cooperation, was on the economic front. And so that's why you see the first 20 years of regionalism, 30 years of regionalism within originally the Asia Pacific, now more broadly the Indo-Pacific, have primarily been focused on the economic front. Ironically, over the last 4 years in particular, with two different factors. One, with growing uncertainty about the US under Trump, and number two, a sharp turn in Chinese approach to the region, particularly under Xi Jinping, right, has led most countries in the region to kind of reevaluate it. So ironically, if you look at the United States pulling out of the TPP, India pulling out of RCEP, the Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership Agreement, yeah, it's increasingly difficult to have agreement on economic issues. Whereas the one area where everybody thought was impossible, the quadrilateral dialogue, has actually progressed far more than most people would have anticipated 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And remember, the Quad is not a new idea. It was first broached well over a decade ago. And there was a time then where Australia was skeptical, India was skeptical, Japan was skeptical, and the US was relatively ambivalent at that point. I think things are different. Right now, what you see is a growing concern, not just about Chinese influence, but the particulars of Chinese behavior in the region that has meant most countries in the region are looking for partners. They're looking for strength in numbers, strength in a collective approach. And so that has given a boost to the Quad that many people would not have anticipated. Now, again, I don't want to overstate it. There's no such thing as an Asian NATO. The Quad is not an alliance. The Quad is at this point just a meeting, coordinating mechanism between Japan, the United States, Australia, and India. So it's a good thing. Now, to get to your question, Korea's absence from that discussion is striking, both in terms of its economic heft, its diplomatic heft, and Canada's military capabilities. The fact that Korea, as a treaty ally of the United States, as a country that has probably more than any other in the region, a deeply vested interest in maintaining sea lanes of communication and being active in that, is not there. It's missed. Korea's abdication is missed in the region. And again, that extends to the South Pacific, to the South China Seas, to the Malacca Straits, to the Indian Ocean. The fact that the 12th or 13th largest economy in the world, a member of the G20, a participant in the East Asia Summit, is not working together with India, with Japan, with Australia, with the United States as like-minded partner, is an omission. I don't think there's an appetite now for a quint. One, I think people rightly assess Korea is not interested or capable at this point in doing. But even if you don't talk about Korea being formally part of the Quad, and you step back and think more broadly, is Korea going to proactively find partners to work with to strengthen the rules-based order, to strengthen the liberal international system? Then you would hope that Korea would be more proactive on that than it has been in recent years.
Yeah, a couple things. I think South Korea is sort of big concern about the Quad. My guess is, certainly from sort of what I've heard on the side of conferences and whatnot, is the fact that it will pull South Korea closer to Japan into some kind of like meaningful military relationship with a focus on China. And I think that's what the public just isn't ready to accept. That particularly the South Korean left just doesn't want that. The United States really had to sort of strong arm this current South Korean government into the GSOMI agreement, the General Security or General Military Sharing Agreement, a couple of years ago. And the South Korean left, which now controls the government and the National Assembly and won all the elections in the last couple of years, and they just don't want this. And we don't have time to get into that whole story. But the smaller the group becomes, I remember sort of reading an article about this once, right? How like in multilateral fora that South Koreans increasingly have difficulty as the groups become smaller and increasingly become sort of, the Japan-Korea relationship becomes more and more intense in a smaller form, becomes more and more difficult for Korea to participate because of public resistance to any kind of like deep cooperation with Japan on security issues, right? So South Korea can sort of participate in things with Japan. If it's like the UN, there's 200 members, something like that. But in a small group like this, it would raise the question of what kind of military integration would South Korea have with Japan? And the South Korean public just isn't there, and the South Korean government just isn't there either. I would imagine that's actually probably the biggest issue. Beyond that, I would suggest that South Korean power projection to the South China Sea into further abroad from the South Korean peninsula, from the Korean peninsula, is just really, really difficult. And that's strategically, that's probably one of the reasons why you're seeing some buck passing on this. South Korea is already spending a huge pile of money in order to try to conventionally deter North Korea's nuclear power, right? That's actually fairly unique, right? Where you have a state trying to use conventional weapons to actually deter a nuclear force, right? The South Koreans are spending now a lot of money on the missile defense KAMD, on the kill chain, on the Korean, what is the massive punishment retaliation, right? I mean, this is all going to cost an enormous amount of money for new air and sea platforms, all of which are aimed at North Korea. South Korea's defense budget is going up. And then to actually sort of meaningfully participate in the East China Sea and South China Sea, where you really start to begin to tangle with a much larger power at the PLAN, would require South Korea to spend even more. And the South Korean public just has not, I don't think the South Korean public has really been properly sort of informed by its politicians over many years about just how expensive South Korean defense would actually be, particularly if the Americans were not here. I would argue that South Korea needs to spend a great deal more on defense, and that debate has only really just begun. And if South Korea is actually going to start to project southward meaningfully beyond just trade relationships, that's going to cost even more money, right? And I think the South Koreans are on their way there, and ironically, that might be one of the benefits of Trump, is sort of pushing South Koreans to actually spend more of their own, right? But I mean, South Korea is basically militarily, South Korea is really tied down by the KPA, by the North Korean military, right? You got 1 million KPA within 20 miles of the border, right? Stacked up in huge echelons north of the DMZ, all the way up to the Pyongyang Wonsan line, right? And so South Korea, no matter what it does, is ultimately going to be a land power, because it's got to put so much force right up front, flush against North Korea. So I'm just not sure that South Korea actually has the ability, barring enormous tax raises and a skyrocketing defense budget, to actually really get heavily involved in the South China Sea. I mean, I've made this argument in my writing in the past. I'd be happy to sort of put that out there, but I agree with Gordan that it'd be great if South Korea got on this a little bit more. But I think the political problems of the relationship with Japan, anything that looks like military cooperation with Japan, is going to raise red flags, particularly in the left-wing press here. And then the sheer expense is a big issue. And I think that's ultimately why the South Korean government has kept its distance, right? I mean, Foreign Minister Kang said, the Quad, didn't she say like a year ago, it's an interesting idea, but it's not for us. I mean, the South Koreans just aren't moving on it, even though, we keep sort of throwing this at them, saying you should help us out, but they don't.
Yeah, my only rejoinder to that is I agree with you completely. You're spot on in terms of the Japanese sensitivity on that. But again, this is one of those things where it puts the Japanese role in context, which I'll come back to that in a second. But the area where I think I'm less convinced is on the budget side of things, because again, as of yet, the Quad isn't, requiring either India to project seriously into the South Pacific. They're not requiring Japan to project into the Indian Ocean. There is no there. It's really just a coordinating meeting function among people who have a similar view of the core underlying principles. And so there isn't at this point a budgetary ramification or a budgetary requirement for South Korea to be part of that dialogue. Now, on the Japan thing, again, you're spot on, but it's still wrong, right? In other words, my view is that, and again, you have put your finger on it, the relative ease for Korea to work with Japan in the UN is because it's very broad. But over the last 4 years, as South Korea has retrenched, and kind of abandoned the global Korea approach and become more and more focused just on the peninsula, when all you're focused on is North Korea, all you have is blood and history, and there's no basis for a cooperation with Japan. If you broaden your aperture and you look at the region and the whole realm of issues that are out there in terms of South Korea's interest, then Japan becomes a very important partner. If you look globally, Japan becomes an even more important partner. And so the aperture through which you're looking becomes the context which you look at Japan. So that very difficulty of working with Japan is precisely the region that South Korea needs an Indo-Pacific strategy, that they need to be engaged with the Quad, that they need to be engaged more globally because it gives context for a relationship with Japan that is more than just history and blood.
Yeah, I don't actually disagree with that sort of, as analysis. I would only argue that in South Korea, that's just not going to come from a left-wing or liberal government. A conservative government might be willing to sort of go in that direction. Next year's presidential election. I do actually think that we don't have too much time for this, but I actually think that South Korea is on foreign policy, particularly North Korea, is very sharply polarized between the right and left in a kind of like France in the 1930s kind of way, right? Where you have a left wing in South Korea that has very, very different understandings of China and North Korea and Japan and the United States than right wing. And that's why you get these big sort of swings in policy regarding North Korea between partisan across interpartisan transitions in the South Korean presidency. I do actually think that a South Korean conservative presidency might actually reach out to the Quad for a Quad plus one kind of thing, but not under the new government. No way. I don't see that.
Agreed.
Yeah. Do you have any more thoughts? Yeah, I just wanted to, because we are having many questions, so I just wanted to move on. Yeah. Actually, let's change the topic a little bit and talk about CPTPP. The possibility of the United States joining the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. What do you think about the likelihood, and especially given China's success in leading the formation of regional comprehensive?
So let me start here as well. Again, if you step back and put this in context, there is absolutely no good reason that Korea wasn't in the original comprehensive or the original Trans-Pacific Partnership agreements. It was just domestic politics tied to domestic instability in Korea. Korea didn't have, at the very end of the Lee Myung-bak administration, the beginning of the Park Geun-hye administration, they post-Korea-US FTA didn't have the energy to drive to get it. So they just kind of thought, we can join whenever the time comes, right?
Right. Yeah.
And the reality is, because Korea already has a gold standard 21st century free trade agreement with the United States, the TPP is actually, chorus minus in most respects, right? Korea is probably the next cab off the rank, the most easy to join country anywhere in the region. If you look at the requirements that would be made upon Korea to join the TPP versus those that were required of Vietnam or of Malaysia, the countries that had to do real serious reforms to get in, it was a relatively easy lift. It was just a political missed opportunity in the case of Korea. It's also important to realize that most people, including myself, on day one of the Trump administration, when President Trump made the decision to withdraw the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, in which I think is one of the great self-owns of international economic diplomacy, just totally damaged American credibility in the region, American leadership in the region, and American influence in the region. At that point, I thought the TPP was dead. Most people did. And it's important to recognize that it was really Japanese leadership and Australian leadership together, which miraculously resurrected this to say, basically, in a world where we're all going back to bilateral agreements and multilateralism failing, we will hold on to this and we'll hold the door open for the US. And thus you end up with the comprehensive progressive agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. And still in that context, Korea should be the first country in. Again, Bob is going to tell us rightly that Japan's role in that has been the primary obstacle, right? But it shouldn't be. It's wrong. It's precisely because Japan, uncharacteristically for Japan, held the line on the liberal rules-based order that Korea depends on, that this is an area we can cooperate on that is not tied to history, that is not tied to blood, that's not tied to comfort women. It is Korea's national interest. But again, you're spot on. There's no one saying that or seeing that in Korea right now. My hope is that while it's not going to happen year one, because the Biden administration's priority is COVID, and then they've got a world of other issues, repairing the transatlantic relationship, repairing alliance other way. My hope is that by the second year, the Biden administration will realize that absent a serious economic strategy, which is the only vehicle going, the TPP, right? The U.S. cannot restore its presence in this region, that the U.S. will come back in. And in that case, there's a much more palatable pathway for South Korea to join, but I don't think it's happening this year, even though it should.
Yeah, on TPP, I'm actually on TPP and its various successors. I'm actually kind of skeptical here. I think on the American side, the Biden people, I mean, Biden himself comes from a more sort of traditional working class Democratic kind of background. The energy in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party now is not particularly keen on free trade agreements. The kind of technocratic liberalism that Obama represented is kind of on the outs, right? And sort of the energy is really sort of on the left in the Democratic Party, and I just don't see them voting for a big U.S. trade agreement. Biden's going to have to do some work to sell it. Doesn't mean he can't do it, but he'd actually have to do some work to push that through. The United States system is riddled with veto points, as everybody knows, right? And so Biden would have to really fight for this, and I just don't know if he cares that much enough about this. I mean, I suppose if it gets marketed to U.S. allies as sort of like the economic flip side of the military pivot, right? The two of them go hand in hand as sort of like part of the American presence in Asia, which I actually think is the best way to market it. I suppose that could be sort of marketed to Republicans, right? And skeptics like, look, we need to do this because we need to work together with the allies because China's on the move, right? I mean, that argument might work because certainly, the American right has been hyping China as a big threat for the last year and a half, right? And if you turn on like Fox News now, it's all sort of China, right? COVID has been sort of relabeled the China plague, right? I mean, this is sort of, it's coming. So that might be one way to market it, but otherwise, I don't see a Democratic administration right now pushing that through. And on the South Korean side, yeah, for the reasons Gordon mentioned, I just don't see a lot of movement there either. My sense is the South Koreans have done pretty well with bilateral FTAs. They got, like Gordon said, they have sort of like a gold standard model for these things now. That's what Chorus and Kourou both are. And so why not continue to sort of do that? Why not sort of shop around these kinds of bilateral agreements with the big countries that you need, rather than going for this big show.
Great. Okay. Any more thoughts? I would like to move on to audience question. Sure. Yeah. We have a question from the audience. Little's been mentioned about what Korea would do in the context of South Korea-Australia bilateral relations, and rather than making explicit Korea's participation in Quad or any other geostrategic settings, like would reinforcing the relationship between Australia lead to desired policy outcomes?
Again, obviously, this is something I've written about. I think someone kindly in the questions put up a link to our report that we released on this specifically late last year. There is a broad range of issues where Australia and Korea are working together already. And it is not hyperbole to say that Australia-Korea relations are the best they've ever been. But if you measure the relationship with the past, that may be true. If you measure the relationship against its potential, it's really clear that there's so much more that could, and in the national interest of both countries, should be done between Australia and Korea to be working together. So obviously, Korea has a free trade agreement with Australia in terms of trade, very important partner in that process. As Australia has now been suffering under some extreme economic pressure from China, retaliatory pressure, and Korea has experienced a similar thing. I think there's plenty of opportunities for Korea to aid South Australia in its project diversification, which is helpful. But in general, I'm of the view that the relationship will never move to the next level until South Korea begins to look at Australia the way Japan does, to look at Australia the way ASEAN does, to look at Australia the way India does or the United States does. And for that to happen, Korea needs to have a broader perspective than a peninsular perspective. They really need to think about what is the broad sweep of history? What is the Indo-Pacific? Because if you have an Indo-Pacific strategy, a partnership with Australia is a no-brainer. Australia is an essential element of that. And while I applaud the still yet ill-formed, New Southern policy, Xinanbang Zhengchek, it really hasn't moved into the diplomatic space. It hasn't moved into the strategic space. And again, it doesn't include Australia. It kind of stops at Jakarta, and it doesn't go into this next realm. I'm someone who firmly believes that in the 30-odd years that I've been working in this field, the defining development of the first era, when the economic center of gravity when I started working in this field in the 1980s was Northeast Asia. It was Korea, Japan, of course, leading, Hong Kong, Taiwan. Over the last 30 years, the growth of China was the defining development. The economic center of gravity shifted southwest. And assuming that COVID doesn't upset the world and that we managed to escape the Trump era and that things don't implode, the emergence of India, the emergence of ASEAN as a whole, Indonesia in particular, Vietnam, mean that economic center of gravity continues to shift southwest. And that is the underlying narrative behind the Indo-Pacific. And while South Korea 30 years ago had a really good strategy for taking advantage of the opening of China, I don't see yet South Korea having a long-term strategy for the Indo-Pacific. And to me, that's the answer. An Indo-Pacific strategy in which Australia becomes a strategic partner in all the elements: trade, investment, critical materials, security, the full realm.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, Australia, Korea is sort of outside of my lane, but I'll just add sort of one thing that the middle power, there are a whole slew of middle powers in Asia, right, who have interests in the liberal international order and rules, right, particularly so that the South China Sea doesn't become like the Wild West, right? Trade is important here, right? It'd be good to have rules there as well. And this is something that, I think like Scott Snyder wrote this once for CFR, right? That countries like Korea and Australia have an interest as middle powers in trying to sort of like work together to push the great powers to try to follow the rules, right? That China and the United States, because of their size, are given to freelancing and skylarking and doing whatever they want, most obviously under Trump, and then to a certain extent with Xi in the South China Sea. And that one of the things that countries like South Korea and Australia and others in the region, Indonesia and so on, the other sort of weighty countries in the region, can do is work together, trying to push these large powers to keep the peace and to follow the rules so we don't get outbursts. Right. So I'll just leave it. The specifics of the foreign policy relationship, I just don't know.
Okay, great. I actually have one follow-up question about this. It's also relevant to an audience question. And so a lot has been stressed about what South Korea needs to do to like bring up this relationship. And is there anything more that the Australian government can do to bring South Korea into the fray?
Absolutely. Almost everything I said about South Korea not recognizing Australia as a strategic partner also applies in the inverse. Understandably, given our shared dependence on China economically, the narrative here is China, China, China. Historically, it was Japan. Korea was viewed as an ancillary of Japan. I view South Korea as, again, the lowest hanging of the low hanging fruit for Australia. So this is a major push of ours as an institution. We did a survey. Our director of research, Dr. Jeffrey Wilson, wrote a report 4 years ago on Australian investment in Korea and Korean investment in Australia. And we came to the conclusion that even when you factored in the size of the economy, when you looked sector by sector at Japanese investment in Korea as a percentage of the investment in the sector overall, South Korea's investment in Australia is about 25% of what it should have been, right? When you compare it with other countries. And part of this, we don't court South Korea. We don't proactively seek out there. So despite what I'm saying here, you're not getting enough attention out of Canberra to say to South Korea, hey, we want to have a dialogue on the Quad. Or to say to South Korea, hey, we would love to have you in the CPTPP to work with us to get the United States ready to go in that process. And so really, almost everything I said also applies to the Australian side. They also need to recognize the potential in that relationship.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Bob, do you also have any thoughts? All right. Okay. Yeah, I would like to also address a different topic, which is the Biden and the Moon administration are so-called liberal, and like so-called the more liberal than the Australian Liberal Party. And should we expect to see greater cooperation on issues like climate change and among other countries? And Moon and Biden pushing Australia on their move to more conservative policies.
There was, as you might imagine, considerable anxiety here in Australia that a conservative government that we've got here had worked very well together with the Trump administration. And then with the transition in Washington, they would be out of sync, and particularly on the issue of climate change. And my view on that has been the last 4 years have shown us that the strength of the Australia-US alliance is far greater than any one man, any one president in the case of Donald Trump, but it's also far greater than any one issue. So yes, no question that with the United States doing a 180-degree turn on climate change, there will be new pressure on the bilateral relationship, and in particular on us here in Australia on that issue. But having said that, as I mentioned in my initial remarks, the spectrum of other issues that we can work on together, which were foreclosed during the Trump era, means that on a net, I'm very optimistic. And the other thing is, you have to recognize that an American conservative and an Australian conservative are largely different beasts. Australia as a society is much more proactive. So here we have, in the state where I live in Western Australia, we had one case of COVID this weekend. The premier made the decision to shut down the entire economy. Everybody's into lockdown for 5 days. For the last 10 months, we've had blissful freedom because there has been no COVID in Western Australia for 10 months because we shut off the rest of the country. You can't conceive of that in the United States. You couldn't conceive of that level of control. The last 2 days as I've been out, every single person in the street, everyone has a mask because that's the type of society we are. We have healthcare. We have a much more government influence economy and society. So even the right wing of our party would fit pretty squarely within the Democratic Party in the United States there. And so as such, I'm really not anxious about any disconnect. If anything, it's probably a recalibration towards the mean, with the exception of a few individuals and a few issues. But in the broad scope of things, you will find Australia working together far more effectively with the Democratic presidency in the United States.
Sure. On Moon and Biden, yeah. Trump was such an outlier that Gordon's last statement also applies to the United States, right? I mean, the United States right, as everybody knows now, is really in trouble, right? I mean, there's sort of active debates about QAnon and whether or not, Democrats are Satanists and stuff like that. I mean, 20% of the American public is talking about this stuff. I mean, the American right is in real trouble because of what Trump did and because of the way he sort of injected, previously fringy, toxic conspiracy theories into the larger Republican Party, right? I mean, this is pretty well known. We don't have time for that now. So the point is that by bringing Biden back, you're getting sort of a return to normality, a return to normalcy, which is one of the points I tried to make at the beginning. There'll be a sort of snapback. So in that sense, compared to Trump, who may represent the future of the Republican Party, the sort of mix of populism and racism and conspiracy theories and the rest of it seems to be relatively potent. If Trump is the future, then of at least of the GOP, then the South Koreans and all U.S. allies will find it much, much easier to deal with the Democratic Party, which has sort of fairly establishmentarian and reality-based takes on U.S. foreign policy, right? I mean, it really is an open question what American foreign policy under a future Republican president will look like, because if it's inflected by Trump, right, you're going to see hedging by U.S. allies all over the place, because that means every time a Republican takes over, it's going to be what you got in the last couple of years. And this is a discussion that you're going to see in Republican organs like the Wall Street Journal editorial page and so on in the coming years. But as far as Moon and Biden, I mean, the basic fact that Biden accepts most of what was pre-Trump, I think will be sort of greeted here well, and their relationship will sort of, like we said, sort of snap back. However, that said, on the big issue between the U.S. and South Korea, on North Korea, a left-wing government in South Korea doesn't really find either the Republicans or the Democrats terribly congenial. The Democrats in the United States are hawks on North Korea too. It's worth pointing out that Biden and Kamala Harris both ran to the right on North Korea of Donald Trump. They both criticized Donald Trump for sort of like what reality TV show diplomacy or sort of drive-by diplomacy, right? Where Trump did it because he won a Nobel Prize and didn't really, take it very seriously, all of which is true, by the way, right? But the Democrats are generally sort of hawkish on North Korea too, right? I mean, the blob, right? What we call the sort of the U.S. foreign policy community, the blob, broadly speaking, is hawkish on North Korea, right? I mean, the only real doves in the United States on North Korea are in international relations and political science departments, right? Overwhelmingly, the policy community is hawkish on North Korea and sees it an opponent, and the Moon government just doesn't, right? And the Moon government just doesn't talk this way. I mean, the Moon government, is quite honestly rather ambivalent about whether or not Japan is a greater threat to South Korea than North Korea. Right? I mean, that's just the way this government talks. And I think that's kind of come as a shock to a lot of Western observers who don't quite understand just how differently the South Korean left thinks about South Korean foreign policy. So on that, I think the Moon and the Biden people will collide. The Biden people are not going to give up on sanctions they're not going to agree that North Korea is a nuclear weapon state. They're just not going to do that. And they're going to fight with the Biden people, or they're going to fight with the Moon people over that. Moon is not going to get to do his projects in North Korea. He's not going to get to do engagement. He's not going to get out from underneath U.S. Treasury surveillance on North Korea, just because he's a Democrat. The Moon people aren't going to get that. They'll try in the same way they tried with Trump and the Europeans, but I doubt they're going to get it. The one other thing, though, I guess sort of the good news is what Gordan said is that on other issues, whatever, I don't know, climate change, since that was mentioned, but other sort of issues of global governance, broadly speaking, the South Koreans will find that the Americans are at least willing to talk and in the room and sort of on the same plane empirically. Nobody's going to talk about QAnon, right? I mean, it's going to be sort of reality based, which will open up possibilities for cooperation on other issues. So in that sense, it's good, right? America is back, as it were, right? Which is, of course, what President Moon said, right? Which means across a panoply of issues, at least the Americans could be somewhat relied upon now to respond normally.
Great, thanks. I think we are moving on to the end of this talk, and I actually wanted to ask this question about the roles that Australia can play in nuclear talks between United States and North Korea. Actually wanted to, there was an audience question asking, is there any room or policy, like possibility of Australia engaging directly with North Korea, like the UK in Pyongyang, for instance?
The short answer is no. And let me just give a little bit of context there. People assume that Australia's position on North Korea and North Korea's nuclear weapons is just an outgrowth of its support for the United States as an ally. But the reality is, going back to what I said in my initial remarks, when I said that Australia relies on the rules-based order, I'm not just talking about trade agreements. I'm also talking about security. In other words, we do not want to live in a world where might makes right. We want to live in a world where there are, comprehensive test ban treaties, when there are limits on missiles, when there are limits on nuclear weapons. And so, in other words, to put this in a very clear frame, Australia is more advanced than North Korea, and by almost any measure, there's not some cultural intrinsical measure, right? Economically, scientifically, diplomatically, militarily, whatever. Yet Australia has made the decision not to develop its own nuclear weapons, not to develop its own missiles, but to instead rely upon the United States and the rules-based order. And so when North Korea pulls out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, when North Korea kicks out IAEA inspectors, when North Korea ignored 6 different UN Security Council sanctions resolutions, that directly undermines Australia's own national security strategy. It directly undermines that rules-based order upon which we rely. And to put a fine point on it, they did so aided and abetted by Donald Trump for a good chunk of the last 2.5 years. The Singapore and Hanoi meetings essentially absolved North Korea of any consequence for their actions and squandered the international coordinated response to North Korea. And so I anticipate that there will be a bit of a snapback on that as well, just by dint of reality, right? Policy towards North Korea will now have to be based on reality, not on the whims of a reality TV president who was just interested in the staging of it, right? And that's going to be a bit of a challenge, but I do not anticipate Australia trying to put itself in the middle there, because Australia's views on this issue are independent and yet similar to the United States?
I'll just add one thing on that. I mean, Gordon's basically right that Australia and lots of other middle powers and small power, or even the Europeans, tend to get sort of pushed aside when the negotiations come up. A lot of it's because of the North Koreans. The North Koreans actually want the prestige of direct one-on-one talks with the American president. This is something the North Koreans have really banged away at for a long, long time, right? This is why South Korea gets sidelined too. North Koreans don't want South Koreans in there either. If you actually look at when Trump met Kim Jong-un at the DMZ, I mean, Kim tried really hard to make sure that Moon was sort of like outside of the frame, right? Because the North Koreans want that one-to-one relationship with the big cheese, right? I mean, that's really sort of core for North Korean prestige. So it's not so much our fault that it's actually North Korea's fault that South Korea and Australia and others get marginalized. I think the one big thing that third parties can do is that they can float proposals to North Korea that the liberal democratic third parties can do is they can float proposals on agreements that the Americans can't actually raise. So for example, I would argue, all right, I got like 60 seconds. I would argue that one of the reason why there was no big deal between Trump and Kim, where there's no sort of final breakthrough in the last couple of years, is because the Americans didn't offer anything remotely commensurate to what we were demanding. We were demanding complete, verifiable, irreversible disarmament, CVID. Basically, wanted the North Koreans to give up almost everything, and we offered not anything really commensurate with that. Basically, sanctions relief, and that wasn't enough. Right? The Americans actually have to offer really major strategic concessions like closing U.S. bases here. Right? There's no way this is going to be said by a member of the blob. They're just not going to say this. Washington is just not there. You know, I go to conferences here all the time, and the military people never talk this way. The State Department people never talk this way. There's just no interest in that. We don't actually know how the North Koreans would respond if we floated the idea of retrenching U.S. forces Korea completely out of South Korea in exchange for like half the North Korean nuclear arsenal. Would they actually go for a really big bang deal like that? The Americans won't broach that because it's too politically radioactive. That's the kind of thing I think the smaller powers might do, is they might put out this stuff that nobody from the State Department is allowed to say. But other than that, you know, I think Gordon's correct.
Well, thank you very much. Look, we are running out of time, and my apologies. We do have lots of questions that have been submitted, and we just don't have the time to get through them. But I do urge everyone who is attending today's session that to jump on Twitter and other social media platforms to follow our presenters here and our moderator to get updates on Australia, US, and Australia relations. Moving on, I do want to thank our esteemed two presenters, Gordan Flake, who's the CEO of Perth US Asia Centre, and also Professor Robert Kelly from Pusan National University, and also our moderator for today, Min Joo Kim from the Washington Post. I want to thank everyone for tuning in. Once again, thank you very much to our panelists and MC, and I look forward to speaking to everyone soon. Please be sure to follow AustCham on Facebook, Instagram, and on LinkedIn. Thank you very much, and talk to you soon.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.